Hi, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you my process for painting this autumn scene. So I start by using my Saunders Waterford paper. It's 9 by 12 cold pressed on a block. And here I am quickly deeply saturating this paper as I begin my wet and wet sky. Note that I've only really done a very brief outline of my painting. I'm going to go in with a fairly light wash of cerulean blue for the sky. And I'm adding here a little bit of raw sienna and some stronger raw sienna towards the bottom of that sky. Okay, now I'm adding a light mixture of raw sienna, quinacridone rose, and cobalt to do the mountain that's farther in the distance. And then I'm doing a stronger mixture of those same colors for the mountain that's in the front, dropping bits of raw sienna to give it a little bit more dimension. I'm adding in some distant trees, using some version of raw sienna. I'm adding a little bit of scarlet and cobalt. I'm keeping this fairly light as I want it to be farther in the distance. Adding a little bit of green, a little bit of warmth to the background. Alright, on the left-hand side that is slightly cut off. I'm sorry for that. I will have to improve my video editing skills. But I'm also using a mixture of raw sienna, scarlet, and cobalt, like the trees on the right-hand side. But I'm adding a little bit of sepia and Payne's gray, where I feel like it pulls it more into the foreground. By the way, don't worry if your trees aren't really looking like trees at the moment. Clearly mine are not. Even the colors are very blue in your face, a lot of cobalt, but the paint is still wet. I still have the freedom to tweak it, add some warmer or cooler colors, and really shape up my trees and make them a bit more convincing. Alright, they're getting a bit more lifelike here. Adding in some green, still keeping it fairly dark, a little bit muted, because keep in mind that you want, in the overall painting, these are going to be in the background, and naturally in the background, the eye sees color as more faded, muted, and very much, the trees don't have to be detailed at all at this point. Adding some more details and line work with my brush. Keep in mind this video is certainly sped up. The full video was a bit too long to post and a little bit boring probably to watch. But just as background information, I am using a Kolinsky Sable brush here. It's a size 10, which is great for my 9 by 12 paper. If you are working with a smaller sheet of paper, you can get away with using a smaller brush, but in general, it's good practice to use bigger brush strokes because it'll be less messy, it'll be just more convincing as well. one of the worst things you can do is overwork your paintings, and that's a lesson I have learned time and time again. Here I am just adding sepia to some of the tree line areas to make them more defined and lifelike. All right, we're finally getting into some of the foreground with the grass and this kind of field. And I'm using a mixture of new gamboge and cobalt blue. Adding some water to keep it lighter on the right side where we have more light, and then I'm adding a darker, slightly darker strokes of that mixture of new gamboge and cobalt coming in from the right side to show where the shadows are. All right, my paint has dried and it's a bit lighter than I want for this field. So I'm coming in again with a mixture of that new gamboge, cobalt, adding in a tiny bit of sepia and a little touch of Payne's gray to get some of those darker shades in that field. And again, the beauty of working wet and wet, I can just go in and keep adding more color until I'm a bit more satisfied with how my field is looking. All right, now that my field has dried, completely dried, I'm now adding in the first bit of foliage that's in the foreground, keeping it still fairly loose, not too defined, but really focusing on the colors. So drops of raw sienna, new gamboge, burnt sienna, and a mixture of olive green that I have made using that same new gamboge and cobalt mixture. Now I'm dropping in some of that lovely rich sepia color while the paint is still wet. Adding some more to the top to blend in the foliage and make it a bit more realistic. Adding a little bit more of that sepia now. Here I am using my flat brush to quickly dampen the area where I'm going to drop in some reflections of that foliage as well as a little bit of that blue sky. You want to make sure it's sufficiently wet so that you have enough time to drop in those reflections and focus on them and build up the color just in case you need it. So here's some cerulean blue to match the same color of the sky on the top. Doing a mixture of that kind of field green again. And don't focus too much on getting the same exact colors, the same exact shape. You do want it to be, proportionate, convincing, but it doesn't have to be perfect. It will look good at the end. I added in some new gamboge at the top, followed by burnt sienna, a little bit of that sepia, a lot of that sepia. A little bit of sepia mixed with Payne's gray, some of that olive green. You want to leave just the tiniest sliver of white if you desire to, make that waterline a bit more realistic, noticeable. I added in some burnt sienna there, which is a bit of a bright option, so I ended up muddling it with some sepia. It might look a little intense right now, but I assure you when it dries, the color will be a lot lighter. So for reflections, you really, only have one or two chances to make them bright, and I would say drop in the richer colors where possible. I'm just swiping away with a damp flat brush right there just to, give that sense of reflection. All right, this is all dried. I'm adding in now my foreground foliage. Using green, darker green mixed with Payne's gray. Trying to vary up my colors a bit after I lay down this initial wash. You want to make sure that the first wash is juicy enough so that you can keep going in with more concentrated colors and build up your foliage without running into problems like backruns and nasty cauliflowers. Adding in some lighter foliage here. And again, this is pretty loose. I don't want to get bogged down in the details right now either. Adding in some of that gorgeous burnt sienna, rich, mixture of burnt sienna and sepia. If you might notice here that I am kind of circling the front of that water to give it that look that this foliage is more up front, and that the mid-ground foliage is truly behind, this water line. I'm now using a guitar pick that you might be able to see. It's my choice tool for quickly scratching out white twigs and branches while the paint is still wet. You really want to do this. You don't want to do this right away when you lay down a wash. It won't do anything. The water and the paint will fill that line right back in. It's kind of the middle stage between halfway drying but still fairly juicy paint, and it's a really fun effect that I love doing against darker paints to give it that stark natural contrast. Okay, we are going to let that dry, and now it has dried. I do apologize because this painting of this tree trunk that I'm doing right now is a bit obscured, but tips for next time. I'm using now, first I go in with raw sienna to do a little bit of the highlight of the tree. I'm using a number 4 Kolinsky sable here. It offers a little bit more control than the bigger brush. Now I'm adding in sepia to do the darker shadows of the tree trunk. So I switched now to my rigger brush, which gives me a lot more of those fine elongated lines. It helps really with trees, and especially going off of branches and making tiny thin twigs look a lot more convincing. I absolutely recommend using a rigger brush. I think this is a size 1. And riggers don't have to be expensive, they just have to be reliable and comfortable for you to use. But I will say the only way to truly get comfortable with a rigger is to practice. A lot of the times you might benefit from holding your rigger brush from the end of the handle. I did not do that this time, but I have used that to do branches that are far, far into the sky. Okay, now that that tree trunk has dried, I'm adding in a bit of foliage and enough to give the impression of leaves, autumn leaves. Some parts of it I have left deliberately more wet just to show or suggest a clump of leaves in the areas, but other points I am making sure I'm using a dry brush method of sweeping across my paper to give the illusion of small, sparse leaves. I'm trying to vary the colors by doing a little bit of raw sienna, a light mixture of sepia and green, really trying to get those sullen fall leaf colors. I'm just going back in now with that rigger brush, adding in branches, twigs in between the areas where I've now painted the foliage. You know, I like to have the effect of twigs coming out of that foliage and extending a little far beyond. Making sure not to make just a continuous line of a twig. You know, I like to make sure that some of the leaves are overlapping. Strengthening up that trunk over there because it, of course, no surprise, dried back a little bit light. All right, switching back to that number 4 Kolinsky brush, doing a mixture of sepia, Payne's gray to add some thicker branches at the top. All right, here we are doing that dry brush method again to give the impression of sparse leaves. And I am adding raw sienna here all across the top of the sky to give the impression of foliage in the top, especially when you take a picture and there are branches coming out from the front. If I've described that well enough, that is what I'm aiming for. So I'm trying to add a little bit more of those darker colors, adding in a little bit of sepia. This painting is quite sepia heavy, in case we haven't noticed yet. But, you know, brown can be beautiful. A lot of the times we get frustrated because color mixing, I'm sure you've been through it, can yield a lot of muddy colors. But it's really, you know, a lot of the light, rich, unique browns can just add so much to a painting. And that's what I love about having that kind of control versus letting everything go to mud. Extending some of those twigs down. You've probably noticed I have switched back to that rigger to give me those fine details. Making sure not to make straight lines. You know, it's something about you can just lean the rigger across the paper sometimes and it'll just dance around and you get some really cool lines. Now I'm noticing I'm getting a little too jagged with that branch, so I'm going to be a little bit more mindful of keeping those branches and twigs more lifelike. All right, we are almost at the finish line. Feel free to share in the comments if you're doing any painting, if you're inspired by the upcoming fall season. Where I am, it's already quite in the beginnings of the throes of autumn. We're definitely seeing color changes and leaves on the ground. It's just definitely my favorite time. All right, that top part has dried. Now I am doing what I do best, which is fiddling around because I am not ever satisfied with my paintings. I'm sure if you've done a few watercolors, you already know what that's like. I am taking a little bit of white gouache, which some people consider cheating, but I really like to add that in areas where I have painted a little too darkly or would like to brighten up. And I don't go crazy with the gouache. I'm adding a few twigs over there in sepia. It's a little bit hard to tell, but I am doing a mixture of that white gouache with a little bit of the new gamboge, trying to add some more light into that area with little dots of yellow. Continuing to fiddle around, adding in a little bit of that gouache to give the illusion of white outlined tree trunks. Realized in retrospect that background foliage was a little too dark or a little shapeless, so no problem. Just adding tiny little details. Again, not going overboard. Otherwise, someone will be able to know. Just fortifying some of those lines that I had made with that guitar pick by adding a little bit of that white gouache. I felt like this area needed a bit more of something going on, so I added some twigs from the field in sepia, a little bit of Payne's gray to make the color a little richer. I'm just having them naturally extend across over that pond. I like that. I like them curving off. It gives more to that shape of foliage. Don't want to spend too much time doing this, so I will probably stop very soon. And that's the finished painting. I'm quite pleased with it. I do like how all the different muted tones mingle together. That little bit of sky reflected in the water, I think that really pulls it all together. Please leave some questions or comments down below. Did you attempt this painting or have you done any other fall themed paintings this year? Please let me know and I will see you all in the next video. Thanks so much and take care.